smell the rain coming off the prairie. Don't have to wonder why. Yeah, now I'm going home and I'll get back in them woods. Said I'm going on home, I'll get back in them woods. Yeah, the scrambling through the scrub hole, get me back to feeling good. She made me happy even when I was sleeping. So glad to be her man.
To the afternoon panel for our meeting with great minds. And as soon as you've grabbed your popcorn and have a good seat, we'll proceed. We certainly don't want to begin before our college president has a good seat. Hello, I'm Virginia Johnson, the longest surviving North Idaho College employee, and I'm happy to welcome you here to moderate this panel. I'm currently the chair for Communication and Fine Arts at North Idaho College. Before we begin our panel today, I'd like once again to have you welcome and thank Charles Pace, who this morning gave a profound presentation as Frederick Douglass. So Charles, would you stand and be recognized, please? Thank you. This afternoon, we only have a couple of our great minds. One of our great minds got sidetracked, and Mr. Jefferson won't, his horse and buggy couldn't quite get here, and he won't be here till Friday at 1. We tried a seance to bring May Arkwright Hutton back, and she just resisted. If you know anything about her, that's her character. She's not answering to anybody, so unfortunately May won't be here today. But we are joined by a couple of the most outstanding American minds, certainly ever, and they are, to wit, the two seated to my left. And they will tell you about their lives, and we'll ask that you sit calmly as each of them presents, and then we'll open up the floor to questions of these two great minds. So I think we'll begin with our woman presenter, and that will be Abigail Adams. And then after she has spoken and told us about herself, Benjamin Franklin. And ladies, doesn't he look darling today? You know, he is reputed to be quite a ladies' man. On the other hand, we know that Mrs. Adams was probably, I've been told I'm related to the Adams family, so I think she was probably the better half of and mother of. Will you please welcome Abigail Adams?
My dearest friend, I wish you would ever write me a letter half as long as I write you and tell me all your news. I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Yours affectionately, Abigail. Good afternoon. My name is Abigail Adams. I wrote those words in a letter to my husband, John Adams, on March 31st, 1776. I'm told that I have a little extra time to speak with you today, and this is good news to me, since I have always enjoyed expressing myself. When my dear husband John was elected to the presidency of our United States, I even wondered to him what sort of president's wife I'd be likely to make, since I would be compelled to impose a silence upon myself when I wished to speak. And so I would like to share with you a little bit about my life and how I became the sort of woman who would implore my husband to remember the ladies. I was born on November 11th, 1744, in the town of Weymouth, Massachusetts, which isn't so very far from Boston. I was a sickly baby, so my father, who was the town pastor, baptized me quickly. I had a happy childhood, but I was often ill, and I needed to stay indoors a lot, and I missed out on some of the activities that my brother and sisters took for granted. As I grew older, I especially wished that I could attend our village school. But even if I'd been healthy, this is probably one thing I wouldn't have been allowed to do. You see, I was discovering that I was a female, and girls were most often educated at home. But there were a lot of important things I needed to learn at home. How to manage a household, to cook, to clean, to sew, to look after the younger children, and to look after for others in our community. I learned these things from my mother and from my special grandmother, Quincy. By their example, these women showed me that young ladies could be brave and involved in events in their own way, but it still didn't seem fair to me that the boys had so many more adventures. By the time I was 10, I'd started to read my way through the libraries of my grandfather and father, and reading served as my schooling. I especially loved classic literature and history. I also was interested in the political events going on around me. I knew that my home was part of an English colony, and I longed to see London one day. I was also interested in how people like my grandfather Quincy could serve on the Massachusetts House of Representatives and yet still consider himself to be a loyal subject of England. I learned to express my ideas by writing letters to family members and friends. When I was sick and confined to my room, these letters helped me keep in contact with the outside world. And to this day, letter writing remains one of my greatest pleasures. But my worry over a lack of formal education has never really left me, and I always worry in my letters that my spelling and punctuation just don't come up to par. By the time I was 15, I had a lot of friends, and I loved my family very much, but no boy had come to court me yet. But this was soon to change. My sister Mary's beau, Richard, had a friend who came with him when Richard would visit our home. John Adams was a young lawyer from the nearby town of Braintree, Massachusetts, and the son of a local farmer. We enjoyed many interesting conversations and began to develop an affection for one another. When I was 17, John Adams asked my father for permission to court me. While my family wasn't unanimous in their support of his suit, they soon were eventually won over. Our courtship lasted for 3 long years while John worked to develop his legal practice. He was often away from our part of the world, and we wrote a lot of letters to one another. These letters took the place of his dear conversation for me and helped us to get to know one another in a special way. I confided to him that my pen is always freer than my tongue. I have wrote many things to you which I suppose I never could have talked. By the time of our marriage, John had become my closest friend and dearest love. On October 25th, 1764, we were finally married. We moved together into a small but wonderful home on John's family farm in Braintree. Most of our needs were provided for by the farm, and we enjoyed our evenings reading newspapers together and talking over the events of the day. But there soon was a cloud over our happiness, one that would separate us for many years of our marriage. And this cloud was the growing conflict between our 13 colonies in England. John believed, and I wholeheartedly agreed, that the increasing attempts being made by England to tax us without proper representation were unconstitutional. While pursuing his law practice, my husband became ever more involved in fighting for the rights of the colonies against this encroachment. His political activities caused him to be away from home for months at a time, but our family still grew. Between 1765 and 1770, I was blessed with 4 healthy and intelligent children: my daughter Nabby, John Quincy, Charles, and Thomas. Sadly, my dear second daughter, Susanna, was never strong and died at only 14 months. This is something that it's still very difficult for me to speak of. With John away, I raised our children and managed our holdings by myself. If I say so, I think I did a very fine job. In fact, I actually began to consider them our holdings. I missed my husband, but I never thought of asking him to quit his important work. The cause of liberty was too important to be quenched with my own individual concerns. I must confess, however, that sometimes I still dreamed of traveling to foreign lands, but don't misunderstand that. To me, being a wife, a mother, and the helpmeet of my husband was the most important role that a woman could fulfill. I was determined to raise my children to be leaders, or at least active participants, in the brand new American independency which John and I now saw as quite inevitable. After the Boston Tea Party in 1773, I feared that revolution would soon be upon us. Parliament did not show any indication that they would stop taxing our colonies. It wasn't long before John traveled to Philadelphia as a representative to the First Continental Congress. This group was going to help shape the colonial response to British oppression. The children and I remained in Braintree. Dear John, the great distance between us makes the time appear very long to me. It seems already a month since you left me. The great anxiety I feel for my country, for you, and for our family renders the day tedious and the night unpleasant. Uncertainty and expectation leave the mind great scope. Did ever any kingdom or state regain their liberty when once it was invaded without bloodshed? I cannot think of it without horror. I want very much to hear from you. Your task is difficult and important. Heaven direct and prosper you. I long impatiently to have you upon the stage of action. I wish you every public as well as private blessing. I want to say more things, I must admit, as it is not fit to wake the soul by tender strokes of art, or to ruminate upon happiness we might enjoy, lest the absence become intolerable. The little flock remember Papa and kindly wish to see him. So does your most affectionate Abigail. P.S. I wish you would burn all my letters. My time, however, was not spent pining for my absent husband. Between his infrequent visits over the next several years, I taught my children to read and write. John Quincy, my oldest son, was a particularly apt pupil, and I was very proud of his progress. As fighting between the colonies and England began in earnest, I also worked to provide food and shelter for families driven from their homes by the war. I cared for wounded soldiers, and I was also proud to be selected on a ladies' auxiliary responsible for assessing the loyalty of those local women who might be loyal to the British cause. As the conflict continued, I needed to marshal our resources against increasing shortages, and I even resorted myself to melting my precious pewter spoons to make bullets for our brave army. I also undertook to have my children and myself inoculated against smallpox. This was a terrifying, although ultimately successful event. Throughout all of this, I kept John informed of the happenings at home. He called me his home front reporter. I replied that I ought to be called Mrs. Delegate, for why should we women not assume our husbands' titles when we give them up our names? Looking back, I believe that my experiences during the war did not necessarily change my nature, but rather accentuated and redefined it. The separations from my husband caused me to become independent. This independence increased as John was away more and more often. He sailed to France in 1777 to try to negotiate an alliance with that country, and John Quincy went with him. This separation was very difficult for me. I was ill, and I delivered a stillborn daughter while they were away, but I knew that any personal difficulties I was experiencing were to the greater good. Dear Hannah, can you imagine me seated by my fireside, bereft of my better half? I feel myself a widow, and yet I asked not my heart what it could do, but what it ought to do. I wish 1,000 times I had gone with him, but I would not exchange my country for the wealth of the Indies, or be any other than an American, though I might be queen or empress of any nation upon the globe. Although John returned as planned a year after he'd first sailed to France, he soon left again. Again, I filled my days. I bought additional land for our farm, although I had to negotiate in my husband's name, since as a married woman I couldn't own property. I also earned money by selling European goods that John sent me from Europe. I felt myself quite the entrepreneur. And since I could not be a voter, I acted as a writer of votes by manning polling stations during Massachusetts state elections. In this way, 5 long years would pass before I saw my dear husband again. The war ended, and America was independent from England's dominion. My growing personal independence, however, made me all the more frustrated about the continuing status of women in our society. My dear Mercy, patriotism in the female sex is the most disinterested of all the virtues. Excluded from honors and offices, we cannot attach ourselves to the state of government. Even in the freest countries, our property is subject to the control and disposal of our partners. Deprived of a voice in legislation, obliged to submit to those laws which are imposed upon us, is it not sufficient to make us indifferent to the public welfare? Yet all history and every age exhibit instances of patriotic virtue in the female sex, which, considering our situation, equals the most heroic. You see, I never believed that my primary and cherished role as a wife and mother would be in any way compromised by political activity. By 1784, my separation from John had become intolerable. My younger sons were growing up, they were 10 and 12, and I left them with my sister. Nabby and I sailed to Europe to reunite with our 2 Johns. We lived in Paris until John finally was appointed America's ambassador to the court of St. James in London. I was to finally realize my wish to see England. I enjoyed London, and I was thrilled to play hostess to many stimulating gatherings, since our home quickly became a gathering place for Americans there. But Congress had yet to decide on satisfactory salaries for our ambassadors. I was forced to be very creative indeed to keep our household provisioned. I was even ridiculed in the London press for doing my own marketing. I did not understand this at all. In America, hard work and thrift are considered virtues. Perhaps this fortitude is what helped us prevail against England. While John served as ambassador and drafted proposals for the new Constitution being written back home, I took delight in my daughter Nabby's marriage and the birth of my first grandchild. Finally, in 1788, after a trip to the shore to indulge ourselves in the new fad of swimming in the ocean, John and I sailed for home. We settled into work, and I enjoyed seeing how my sons had grown and welcomed the challenge of our new larger holdings. Then on April 12, 1789, John was informed that he had been elected to the vice presidency of the United States. Our lives were about to change again. I was, however, greatly put at ease when I met Martha Washington. Our 2 families would remain close friends. Regretfully, poor health kept me in Massachusetts for most of John's vice presidency. He presided over the Senate during congressional sessions and returned home on the breaks. Correspondence helped John and I continue to grow closer, despite our unorthodox living arrangements. My dearest friend and husband, years subdue the ardor of passion, but in lieu thereof, a friendship and affection deep-root subsists, which defies the ravages of time, and will survive while the vital flame exists. Our attachments increase, I believe, with the years. Your affectionate Abigail. In 1796, President Washington announced that he would not seek re-election at the end of his second term. The Federalist Party endorsed John as their candidate for the presidency, and I was very proud. I assured him of my support. My ambition will extend no further than reigning in the heart of my husband. That is my throne, and there I aspire to be absolute. In a matter of such momentous concern, I will not attempt to influence you. The presidency may be a most unpleasant seat, full of thorns, briars, and thistles, but the hand of Providence ought to be attended to, and what is designed, cheerfully submitted to, for I'm sure it will lead to a flattering and glorious reward. But the election process was one that I would not wish on anyone. Opposition presented itself in the form of Thomas Jefferson, the Republican candidate. But though wrong in politics, I did not think him an insincere or corrupt man. My friendship for him, developed in France years ago, remained unshakable. I perceived John's most pernicious foe to be Alexander Hamilton, a fellow Federalist. I believed him to be a dangerous man, ambitious as Julius Caesar, a subtle intriguer with a thirst for fame. I have ever kept my eye on him. As John suffered these political intrigues, I was having interesting experiences of my own back home in Quincy. During the Revolution, I had worried that our southern colonists would not fight effectively for liberty, since they had no problem whatsoever in enslaving their fellow human beings. Now I realized that this sort of prejudice was not limited to the southern regions. I had sponsored James, one of our serving boys, to attend a local evening school. A neighbor visited me to allege that certain others, who remained unnamed, were objecting to the boy's presence there on the grounds of his skin color alone. I informed my neighbor that James had as much right as anyone to pursue an education and urged him to go tell those others that I hope we will all go to heaven together. I probably do not need to tell you that no further complaints were made. 1797 was an eventful year for our family. John was successfully elected president, and John Quincy was married in London. Although I longed to be at my husband's side, illness kept me away from Philadelphia, where our nation's capital was, for his inauguration and the first several months of his presidency. Once I was finally able to join him, I learned to appreciate the peace and quiet of my farm. As First Lady, I received constant visitors and was obligated to make calls in return, although I quickly realized that by making my calls at certain times, I could do it more quickly by visiting when the ladies were not home. I began to rise at 5 o'clock in the morning so that I could have 3 hours to myself every day. I also spent time serving as my husband's sounding board and minister without portfolio. I wrote letters on his behalf to other people expressing his views on certain topics. This was especially critical in light of the downright wicked treatment my poor husband was suffering at the hands of the press. They descended like vultures upon my husband's administration, printing lies, falsehoods, calumny, and bitterness. Many publications printed stories that were false as hell, or if that is too rough a term for a lady to use, false as the English. The stress of this constant activity finally overwhelmed me, and I was seriously ill by the time we were able to return to Quincy for the summer. A combination of malaria, dysentery, and diabetes kept me in bed for 11 weeks, with several months of recuperation following. I encouraged John to keep me informed of the events in Philadelphia. I also fretted about my children, especially Nabby, whose good-for-nothing husband was ever a thorn in my side, and Charles, who was showing signs of a mysterious constitutional instability. Still, I rebuked John for mentioning to me that George and Martha Washington must be the happier for never having had children, for if they had none to give them pain, they had none to give them pleasure. Worried about my health, John returned to Quincy to be by my side for several months in 1799. The president's absence from our nation's capital, however, drew criticism. I determined to return to Philadelphia with him for our last season there. The capital was being moved to Washington, D.C., and a house was being built for us. By 1800, as we prepared for our move to the new capital, it was becoming clear that John might lose the upcoming election. Still, we bravely carried on with our duties. The death of our son Charles in November made this even more difficult. I mourned my poor unhappy child. He was beloved in spite of his errors. I gathered Charles's wife and children to me and took them with us to Washington. As our journey drew to a close, I could see that my final days as First Lady would be my most challenging. We got lost in the woods on the way to the house, and when we finally found it, it was in the middle of an enormous wilderness. While our home was well built and of enormous proportions, it was unfinished and largely unfurnished. The new capital city, exist though it might in the minds of the planners, did not yet in reality. The damp climate and poorly heated house aggravated my rheumatism, and I was often in pain. Still, it was my duty as First Lady to prepare this House for the visits we expected from foreign dignitaries. I had no intention of failing, and in hindsight, I do not believe that I did. I've now come to the end of my story. My John lost the election, and Thomas Jefferson will become our nation's third president in a month's time. I wish him well. John and I look forward to returning to Quincy to spend our time farming, pampering, and instructing our grandchildren. I have heard that John Quincy will be returning to Massachusetts sometime this year. Since his wife is expecting a baby, I also have the anticipation of a new grandchild to look forward to. John and I have been married for 37 years now, and for the first time, we do not expect to be separated again. Our marriage has been the mainstay of my life, in which I have considered myself to be a full partner. I wish that all women could share my good fortune, but I know that much has to change before this becomes a reasonable expectation. First, young girls must be privy to the same education as boys, for no man ever prospered in this world without the consent and cooperation of his wife. It behooves us, who are parents and grandparents, to give our daughters and granddaughters such an education that shall qualify them for the useful and domestic duties of life. For how can we expect poorly educated women to properly instruct the next generation? Moreover, I will never consent to have our sex considered in an inferior point of light. Let each planet shine in their own orbit. God and nature designed it so. If man is Lord, woman is Lordess. That is what I contend for. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Adams, for those stirring words. Our second great mind this afternoon is probably no stranger to you, and that is our founding father. Please welcome Benjamin Franklin.
Welcome. It is no surprise to me that Mr. Jefferson could not be here. Mrs. Adams' husband, John Adams, and I worked the man pretty hard for a while, and I suspect he's still running from us. Throughout my life, I've been known for a lot of things. I'm a writer, a publisher, a printer, an inventor, a scientist, a diplomat, a politician, a statesman, and a patriot. I was born in Boston, Massachusetts, January 17th, 1706. I was born to a fairly poor family, but during my lifetime, I was able to make a lot of money and try to improve society. I was able to make improvements that a lot of people today still enjoy. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my life, and I'm going to tell you, starting with my life as a printer, and also my life as an inventor with bifocals, which I have to use to be able to see some of my notes. So you'll have to excuse me. As a child, I loved to read and to collect books. I also loved to write. And as it came time to choose my trade, my father decided that I should become a printer. So I apprenticed to one of my older brothers, James. And I was at the ripe old age of 12 at that time. My apprenticeship with James did not last a long time. I did my silence do-good letters, which James didn't know about at first, but he did print them in his paper, and was really kind of mad at me when he found out that I was the one that was doing them, and that sort of set the tone for our relationship thereafter. At the age of 22, I opened my own printing shop. It was the Pennsylvania Gazette. A few years later, Poor Richard's Almanac was printed, and I was selling over 10,000 copies a year. Soon, I became the most active printer in the colonies and was appointed the official printer of Pennsylvania. My duties included printing money, laws, and documents for the colony. I then became the public printer for Delaware, New Jersey, Maryland. I also helped establish newspapers in New York, Connecticut, and 2 islands in the West Indies. I also was a librarian for a while. I believed in books and I believed in reading, but most people could not afford books. They could not afford to buy them and then to acquire them and to keep them. So I helped form the first public library in Philadelphia. Became a librarian for a while, and that was in 1731. I'm also known as an inventor, and an inventor was one of my passions. Many of you do not know some of the inventions that I have done, one of which is the swim fin. You guys use it today in scuba. Put them on your feet, it propels you through the water a lot better. When I was about 11 or 12 years old, I decided that I wanted to see if I could swim faster through water. So I made some paddles for my hands and tried to swim through water with the paddles. It didn't work so well. They were a little on the cumbersome side, and they kind of floated and didn't want to go in the water too well. But that was the beginning of my career as an inventor, as well as many of the other things that I did. I also invented bifocals. This was in the year 1784. I had trouble seeing what was printed and trouble seeing afar, so I always had to bring 2 pairs of glasses. One of the things that bothered me was always having to take one pair off, putting the other pair on, reading what I was looking at, taking them off again so I could look back at the people that I was talking to. So, bifocals. Half a lens for reading close up, half a lens for seeing at a distance. I also invented something that you refer to today as the Franklin fireplace. The Franklin fireplace was not called the Franklin fireplace when I invented it, of course. It was called, actually, at that time, the Philadelphia fireplace, because in Philadelphia in the 1730s, there were a lot of fires. And you have to kind of understand at that time, the main way of heating a house was through fireplaces, and fireplaces were not necessarily safe. And they were not efficient either. They made a lot of smoke, and a lot of the heat went up the chimneys, and I noticed this, and I started paying attention. I wanted to do something to try to help the problem. Well, several things came out of this. One was a fireplace that was freestanding, made out of cast iron, that smoked less and kept more heat in the house, but it was much, much safer. People tended to burn down houses less often. One of the other things I did in the same time period was to take and help develop the first functioning fire department, which was something we did to help try to curb the fires of the time. And another thing that was unique during that period was we were trying to help the people whose houses would burn down and they'd be left with no possessions, left with no money. And we also formed what you would consider to be the first fire insurance agency. So in the 1730s, I was quite busy. But one of the things that really struck me is that inventions are for the good of people. They're not for people to make money off of. I've never patented and protected the patent on any of my inventions. The Franklin fireplace was for the people. It was my firm belief that inventions that we use for our better good were best used for the lowest cost, and that every person should have a right to them. Some of my other inventions of note, one was called the armonica, which is actually an Italian word that means harmonious. Does anybody in the audience know what an harmonica is? A few people. Well, an harmonica is a very unique invention. It's not a harmonica, as some people know of things today. I took glasses of different sizes, what you would call crystal goblets, but we did not have crystal in the same form back then. And I took the stem off, made a hole in it, put them onto a spindle, and so they were on their side, on the spindle, of different sizes all the way down. The spindle was on a treadle. The tread wheel would make the spindle spin. You could wet your fingers, put your fingers over the glass, and they would make different tones. Beethoven and Mozart, for example, developed music for this. It was the word you would use today is ethereal. And it was a very wonderful invention, but I don't notice that people really use it today, which I'm very disappointed about. Indeed, I played the harmonica, and my daughter played the harpsichord, and we would do duets in our house. Another invention that many of you are probably aware of is the lightning rod. Now, of course, I could take a literary license and say, well, I invented lightning or I invented electricity, but of course, electricity already existed, lightning already existed. My intent was actually to prove that lightning was not punishment from God, as most people in my time thought, but lightning was just electricity. an electricity that was not a product of any angry god, but just a natural phenomenon. And many of you, of course, know about my famous key and kite experiment. Well, I wasn't as dumb as you probably thought I might be at the time. I knew lightning could probably hurt me pretty bad. And my son William, who was about 21 at the time, and I actually experimented a couple times. I was knocked unconscious twice, believe it or not, from this experiment. And it wasn't much fun, I have to admit. But we were actually very smart about this. We used silk for the kite because of its strength during a storm. We tied a little wire to the top of the kite to act as an attractor for the lightning. And of course, at the bottom of the string is the famous key that a lot of people are aware of. Well, the key indeed did get charged, and when I went to touch it, static electricity or electricity came off of it, and it did shock, but that one didn't knock me out, at least the final one. But that was one of the more interesting things that I did. There were several other things that you probably are not aware of that I invented, and just to give you a little bit of an idea, odometers, ways of tracking how many steps that you take. I also worked, besides on fire departments and trying to create things that better people like that, we were looking at how we could better deliver mail to people, and so postal system was one of my little inventions, if you could say it's an invention, because it already existed, but I made it better, I made it more efficient. But one of the things that we wanted to do to make it more efficient was basically to find out how far people were going and basically see how much they could do in a day in the most efficient manner. So an odometer was one of the first things one of the things that I conceived of. I also was very interested in how the trade winds would carry ships, and so I mapped trade winds, which was kind of interesting as well. In fact, when I was a child, I probably dreamed more of being a sailor than anything else. Printer, statesman, inventor, etc. kind of came as life went on, but a sailor was what I really wanted to be. One of the other things that I invented in terms of ships, actually, though, besides mapping trade winds and helping people travel, was I helped develop bulkheads in ships to keep ships afloat when they were damaged. So separating bulkheads in ships, that was another one of my ideas that I came up with. There were several other things, including a rocking chair with a fan, but that didn't take off for some reason. I haven't figured that one out. An arm extender where I could grab a book up on a top shelf because I had quite a library, so just a book grabber. But again, that didn't take off too well. But I also invented a stepping stool too, so that actually was a little bit more practical. Writing desk with a built-in chair, and there were probably a number of other things that, again, I did not charge and put patents out on that I believed in was for the good of people. Another thing that I did, and a lot of you are probably more aware of this than anything else, I was one of the original drafters of the Declaration of Independence. Mr. Jefferson was actually the person on what we called a committee of 5 that did the actual writing. John Adams was on this committee, Roger Sherman, John Livingston, and myself, along with Thomas Jefferson. But he was the youngest member, and he was quite young at the time. And we thought, he had a lot more energy than we did, so we'd dictate to him, and he wrote, by and large, most of the Declaration of Independence. I was also involved in a number of other things that had happened in terms of the independence for the what would become called the United States. I was the only person who was not only on the drafting of the Declaration of Independence, but the Treaty of Alliance with France, which is where we allied ourselves against the British. They helped us out in the war. We negotiated for new munitions, foods, and other supplies. I was also at the agreement that was formed with Britain, allowing us to create the country that you now enjoy. I was also a member of the committee and the group that worked on the Constitution. I was the only person during this time that was on all 4 of those, so I was pretty involved in that as well. The thing is, I lived a very, very good life. I did a lot of things. I was known for being a good orator. I think I'm over 300 years old now. I'm not as good as I used to be. My wit is probably not as sharp as it used to be. I passed away April 17th in 1790 at the age of 84, but I did more in that 84 years than most people could do in several lifetimes, and I had more influence, probably in a lot of ways. I'm going to share with you some wisdom. All of you are probably aware of Poor Richard's Almanac, which I produced for quite a number of years, and many of you are probably aware of some of the witticisms that I wrote in this particular almanac. One of the things that you're probably not aware of is most of those witticisms, I was not the writer of them. I was just a distributor of them. Back in the time when I was writing and doing a lot of my work in the printing industry, we oftentimes did not quote or cite where we got sayings from, and people before us did not quote or cite where sayings came from either. Over 90% of all the witticisms that people try to give me credit for today, I did not write. All I did was make them available for the general person, the average person to enjoy. I'm going to share some of those with you, and I'll leave you with that. A countryman between two lawyers is like a fish between two cats. I like that one. My friend Mr. Adams didn't like it for some reason. A little neglect may breed mischief. For want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, the horse was lost. For want of a horse, the rider was lost. This is one I think many have heard. A penny saved is a penny earned. A very good witticism. Any fool can criticize, condemn, and complain, and most fools do. At 20 years of age, the will reigns. At 30, the wit. At 40, the judgment. Diligence is the mother of good luck. Dost thou love life? Then do not squander time, for that's the stuff life is made of. Early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. That one is very famous. I did not write that one. Energy and persistence conquer all things. Experience keeps a dear school, but fools will learn in no other. Fish and visitors smell in 3 days. We discovered that. Genius without education is like silver in a mine. God helps them that help themselves. Haste makes waste. Having been poor is no shame, but being ashamed of it is. He that goes a-borrowing goes a-sorrowing. He that lives upon hope will die fasting. Hide not your talents. They were for use they were made. What's a sundial in the shade? If you would persuade, you must appeal to interest rather than intellect. Kill no more pigeons than you can eat. Little strokes fell great oaks. Never confuse motion with action. Never leave till tomorrow, which you can do today. Read much, but not many books. The sleeping fox catches no poultry. They that will not be counseled cannot be helped. If you do not hear reason, she will rap you on the knuckles. Think of these things, whence you came, where you are going, and to whom you must account. 3 may keep a secret, but only if 2 are dead. So true, we found out. To find out a girl's faults, praise her to her girlfriends. To lengthen thy life, lessen thy meals. Well done is better than well said. Whatever is begun in anger ends in shame. When sense is wanting, everything is wanting. I will leave you with those words.
Thank you so much, Mr. Franklin and Mrs. Adams. At this point, we would like to open the floor for questions for either of our historical characters. So if you have a question for Abigail Adams or Benjamin Franklin, please raise your hand. I have the microphone, which I'll bring to you. Or Tony, Tony will bring the microphone to you, and you can direct your questions to either of them. Questions?
Franklin, when you were in France, and I believe it was in what years?
1876? Or 1776, 1778, the Treaty of Paris.
This was before the French Revolution then?
Correct.
I see. Did while there, did you feel reverberations or the coming of this revolution? And did you perhaps learn something of Voltaire and the liberal movement in France at the time?
I did. I enjoyed France quite a bit, and I've been accused of, at that time, my common law wife had been dead for a few years, and I was accused of being very interested in women in France, particularly. Indeed, I've been accused of womanizing, and Mrs. Adams here is not too happy with me because of possibly, I'm not certain, but she thought I probably corrupted her husband to some extent. But
my husband was incorruptible.
I was not, and she thought that I would. At any rate, I was distracted. I did pay a little attention to French politics. The French tended to like me, but by the time at the end of my stay, I think my welcome was sort of worn out, basically. The French were very polite to me. I did not engage too much in French politics, but I did engage in other things.
Mr. Franklin, you were born in 1706, and you did all of these things in 1784 and up and then. You were long past the average age for people to be gone, and this is a wonderful thing for us to realize that those things could have happened in your life. But how did you do this at that age?
People have asked that question before, and I really believe that the way a person lived their life is really going to impact how long they live. A lot of the witticisms that I shared with people had to do with how to treat other people, how to save and how to be thrifty, how to also live their life better. Early on, I turned to being a vegetarian because eating of flesh, besides being too expensive, and it impacted my ability to read or to buy books, which I was really interested in. I also felt it wasn't as necessary for us. But nonetheless, I always had an energy and always would be constantly busy. I'd get up early in the morning, do a lot of work during the day, no sloth, basically just constantly doing things, constantly having a purpose, constantly having a mission in life.
Mrs. Adams, your children were successful, I'm sure, in their own right, but most of the effort was put towards John Quincy. How did the other children do in their political careers or farming careers?
Well, my daughter had a husband who was not of the highest character. She lived with us a good bit of the time. My son Charles died quite young of a liver malfunction. My son Thomas was a slow starter, but he eventually became a judge and had 8 children with his wife. So we enjoyed his large family very much. John Quincy did very, very well, and I like to think that it was due to some of my good advice to him. I always tried to stress to him that from those to whom many good advantages are given, there's much expectation. And John Quincy always worked to live up to that.
Mr. Franklin, once the war started, of course, it had quite an effect on personal relationships, family relationships. How did you manage to negotiate lifelong friends, family members who differed with your position, and how did others manage to come back together once the nation became a new nation?
This is a good question, and one of the things that people don't know too much about me is I had one child, William, out of wedlock, and this was before I moved in with my common law wife, Deborah Reed, which is in about 1730. William and myself both were more or less loyal Englishmen for a long time, and indeed it wasn't until closer to the time of revolution that I was starting to get disillusioned with the politics of England and what I perceived to be the unfair treatment of the colonies and the people in the colonies. Particularly one time there were some letters that were intercepted that I got a hold of when I was in England before the revolution, called the Hutchinson Affair, basically where we discovered that England was trying to further remove colonial rights, essentially. But interestingly, during the same time, my son William was also very loyal to the English, and when the independence came, when the war came, he supported the English. And this forever changed the nature of our relationship. We had done a lot of things together. Again, he was there with me with the famous lightning experiment, but he remained loyal to England, and I could not bear that. That was one of the big changes that occurred. But this did not just affect one family. There were many families that this was impacted by. But that was the biggest one and the dearest one to my heart.
I wanted to ask you, at age 70, your witticisms that you were reciting, some of them. One of them was to read a lot, but not too many books. How come?
Probably one of the better questions. I don't have a real good answer to that. Of course, I'm over 300 years old, so maybe my mind is probably dull. But the reality is there are a lot of things to read, not just books. There are newspapers, and newsprint was one of the things that motivated me, and getting articles out. And there were a lot of other things that you could read. But you could also read people as well.
Mrs. Adams, you wrote the letter to your husband about not forgetting the women. Unfortunately, they did. And I'm wondering what your thoughts were after that.
Well, they did forget the women. He did give me the credit of writing to let me know that, instead of my just finding it out later. And I was very disappointed, but somewhat resigned at the same time. To tell you the truth, even though my husband allowed me to be a partner in our marriage, I did not have the same high expectations of other men. And so I believe that his good intentions perhaps were overwhelmed by the lesser individuals that were participating. But I trust that my John did his best.
This question's for both of you guys, because one was a politician, one was married to a politician. Were politicians back then as covert and shady, I guess, in their day-to-day business as they are today?
They did not get along. The Committee of Five, John Adams, myself, Roger Sherman, John Livingston, and of course Thomas Jefferson, did not all get along on our thoughts on how things should be, how things could be as well. Some of us considered ourselves moderates, some of us considered ourselves more reactionary and revolutionary. As far as being covert or hiding our feelings, we tended to, at least in the Committee of Five, wear them on our shoulders. We knew where each other stood. We had to compromise. We deliberately did not deceive each other. We disagreed openly. We disagreed vehemently at times. But nonetheless, I don't believe we were trying to run alternative agendas.
At the risk of sounding a little bit bitter, My husband found that sometimes his attempts to do the best for our country were overrun by more forceful or persuasive personalities, such as the gentleman on my left. In fact, John desired very much to leave France because during the course of the the alliance negotiations, many times his opinion was being pushed to the side, and so he was greatly frustrated during that time. So politics, I believe, has been a contentious issue since the formation of our country.
And it probably should be known that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson absolutely did not get along, particularly after the colonies had joined together. And in your history books, you can look at the Federalists and the Jeffersonians in terms of that particular antagonistic relationship that occurred there. Yes, and I had been accused of being a little forceful myself in terms of the Declaration of Independence. Indeed, while Jefferson wrote it, he oftentimes complained John Adams and myself dictated it, and he only wrote what we dictated. But nonetheless, again, I feel we're at least somewhat honest with one another in terms of what our interests were. But Mrs. Adams' comment does justice to the relationship. Some of us were able to get our words heard better than others.
And it was a great disappointment, actually, to our family that our political system did break into two parties so very quickly. I always believed that we should not have party politics, that actually distracted from the business of government. And we didn't get as much done when the parties were doing nothing more than fighting between themselves.
There was one issue in particular that I cared about very largely, and that happened to be the abolition of slavery. One of the last things that I did before I died was to sign a petition for the abolition of slavery, but the politicians of the time did not agree on this issue, and it took quite a number of years for this issue to come to head.
Mr. Franklin, did you ever run for political office yourself? Why or why not?
At the time that the Declaration of Independence was signed, I was in my 70s. I'd already done a lot of things. I'd been appointed to a number of posts, particularly in terms of being a delegate for France, or to France, and some other things. Postmaster General was one that I was appointed to at a later date, and so on. At that time, I had no interest to run or to engage in larger political issues.
Mrs. Adams, let's talk about culture, northern and southern. When you were in Philadelphia and Washington, did you and your husband, John, really understand or come in contact with the so-called Southern culture? There is a difference, I'm sure, between North and South even then.
Well, truth be told, we were in Washington, D.C. very briefly only, less than a year, and it was very difficult for me to adjust. I felt that the pace of life was much too leisurely, and I felt that people relied on servants or slaves, which I felt was an abhorrent institution, to the detriment to themselves, because the virtues of hard work and industry and thrift, which I felt were so important from my upbringing in Massachusetts, I felt were not being pursued actively by many of the more wealthy Southerners. And I thought that that was actually something that would be deleterious to their own development.
Mr. Franklin, with all your many accomplishments and looking over your life, is there anything especially that you wished you could have accomplished? You mentioned about slavery, but and I know you've done some work with Confederation, with the Iroquois Indians and so forth, but is there anything especially that you wished you could have accomplished?
Hindsight is always 20/20, and you mentioned the work of working with the Iroquois Confederacy. One of the things that I participated in was trying to study what form of government we would end up coming up with. We studied the republics of the Romans, Greek democracy. And one of the things that had been neglected in history books that were written later on was the fact that the Iroquois Confederacy was one of the models that we had studied in terms of representative democracy. And as I said, hindsight is always 20/20, but to have given more credit where credit was due would have been a very good thing to have done, I think, at the institution of this particular country. The issue on abolition of slavery was one that meant something to me for quite a long time. It's one that it was 2 months before I died that I signed the petition to abolish, but I'd not seen enough headway or hardly any headway on that, and that was a big regret as well. But again, hindsight's always 20/20 on issues such as the Iroquois Confederacy.
This question is from Mr. Franklin. This is a hearsay. I heard a long time ago, and I had to ask the question since you're here. Is it true that you extolled the virtues of mature women as instructors of young men in the arts of courtship and lovemaking?
I don't remember that. But I heard that there were rumors to that effect myself. But I will tell you this. I was not married at the time that I was in France. My wife had passed away, and I did involve myself in several affairs, but I will leave it at that.
As if that is any excuse for licentious behavior.
I thought Mrs. Adams was going to faint, but there for a moment.
Mrs. Adams, have you ever thought about running for office yourself? I realize that women can't vote, but there's no law that said they can't run. Have that thought ever come in your mind?
To be quite honest, no. Just because I wanted to be able to express my political views and perhaps to vote and participate politically, I never believed that I really wanted to leave my domestic sphere. I believed that it was very important, the job that I was doing, of raising my children and keeping the home. But I also believed that perhaps if women had more of a voice, then perhaps we could have more of an education, and then we could do a better job at raising our children.
Mrs. Adams, I compliment you very much on being able to wear so many hats. You are a wonderful example for us women. I wanted to ask you if education for women was, formal education was going on in England, and if so, were the fathers of our country going backwards in human rights instead of forward?
I believe that the English actually were even, the English women that I encountered were even more poorly educated than the American women, because they spent a great deal of their time in pursuit of fashion and pleasure and not enough in serious pursuits. So I believe that actually American women, especially if they gave an effort to it, were better educated than the English women I encountered.
Yes, Mr. Franklin, you talked about the many inventions you made, and that you made many of them for the good of the people, which I believe is a very noble cause, and that you had not bothered to patent any of them. I'm curious, in your travels and so on, did you see many people who were copying your inventions and who were possibly making a profit from them? And if so, what was your reaction to that?
That is a good question. And in terms of the stove, I did see a number of those pop up. And actually, my reaction was basically that I was glad to see it out there being used. There is one maxim that I did not say, but an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And one of the issues dealing with the fires in Philadelphia in the 1730s was that a little bit of taking care would have stopped and saved a number of people's lives. It would have saved a lot of possessions and property. And the invention of the stove was really instrumental in helping save some fires from being started. So anything like that I saw that was being distributed, I appreciated. As far as others profiting from my inventions, I did believe in the ability to do so, but I also firmly believe in the ability to share inventions for the greater good of people. So always that was probably an issue that I would say was problematic for me. But it was the fireplace most. Lightning rods, again, it's the same thing. If people have them on their barns or on their houses, they're saving property and they're saving lives. I don't care how it gets there. I like to see the fact that people were using it, and I did see that as well. I'm afraid the swim fins, I never did see anything happen with that one.
Here's one more time.
Then we're going to the...
Forgive me for speaking again, but many times I heard my wife sing to the kids, my hat had 3 corners had my hat. Do you have anything to give us more information on the 3-cornered hat?
You know, I used to know more about the 3-cornered hat, but I've forgotten more than I know now, and the answer would be no.
Adams, do you know anything about the tri-cornered hat?
I do not recall if I ever knew.
We'll ask Mr. Jefferson when he gets here on Friday. Perhaps he knows, since he's a know-it-all. At this time, I'd like to thank our historic characters and ask if they would now speak to us in their contemporary selves as Julie Tiger Liegert and Alan Lamb. And again, you'll be welcome to ask them questions. So.
Well, all I can say is it's been a number of years since I've done Ben Franklin, and it's always fun to brush up. And there's a lot more that I don't know about Ben Franklin than I know by a long shot, because it always amazes me how much I read about him and how much that he's done in terms of his life. There are some things about him that I don't like, and I have to admit, one of the things that I don't like is his thoughts and his attitude sometimes towards American Indians was not good. In terms of, at one time historically, I believe he helped pay for a bounty on heads. And so, anyway, everybody's human. And Ben Franklin, as much as we put him up on a pedestal, and he's done a lot of great things. He's done more great things, I think, for humanity, for this country, than most could ever conceive to do. But for all that, he was human, and he was subject to human frailties. And he had a weakness for women, and he was a womanizer, okay? Of course, he wasn't going to tell people that. But
strangely enough, they really liked him.
I haven't figured that one out either, but nonetheless, they did really like him. He was very popular. And he was popular in courts because of his wit and because of his intelligence. He was obviously one of the most intelligent men, of his time. He really was. At any rate, all I can say is it's an honor to be able to even slightly emulate him. And believe me, there is so much to learn about this man.
I'm Julie, and I teach history, so this is a pretty natural fit for me. And when I first discovered Abigail Adams, she really redefined for me what it meant to be political. That even without the vote and even without a formal education and from your home, you could still influence so much and do your part in your way. And so I really enjoyed that about her. And what I've really enjoyed preparing for this is that as I was researching, my daughter, who is almost 8, and she's here, she left the room, she's out there, she checked out from her school library a biography of Abigail Adams, and she's in 2nd grade. This book is 200 pages long, and she read it. And so, she got interested too. And so I think that it's been a really fun process for both of us. And I've really enjoyed bringing this to you. She was also a fiery woman. I like that.
Yeah, she was a fiery woman. And I wanted to mention one other thing, too, that I like about Ben Franklin, is he had a very strong interest in education. And the University of Pennsylvania basically has its roots in his efforts and his formation of the college. And, I'm not an historian, so history for me is just something that I happen to run across and read about when I'm interested. But nonetheless, there are a lot of people in our history that are worth learning about and learning what drove them. Because if we had more people like Abigail Adams or more people like Ben Franklin, I have a sneaking hunch our country would be a lot different than it is now even. They were great people. They truly were great people.
Do any of you have questions you'd like to address to Julie or to Alan about development of their characters, how much of their lives have been burned up doing this, which I can tell you is plenty.
This is for both of you. You've obviously done quite a lot of research, and this is just as kind of a little interesting tidbit. What's the most interesting or fascinating or shocking thing that you learned about this person?
Besides the bounty on Indian heads that he was involved in at one time, that was probably the most shocking. But I have to admit, I ran across that bit of information probably 4 years ago when I prepped for this character before. This time, probably nothing too new. He was, born an Englishman and died a U.S. citizen, American. And he was very proud of that fact, and he was very proud of what he had done to help the colonies, form into their own nation. It reminded me of some of the atrocities that were occurring at that time. We talk about the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, the Intolerable Acts, like the Quartering Act and stuff like that. Those were all horrid things that the English were doing, and it just reminds me that, people do take advantage of other people when they can. I mean, the English at one time were actually charging for taxes on the number of fireplaces people had in England. If you had 4 fireplaces, you'd get taxed more money for it. They were finding anything they could to tax on, and I mean, people were taxed to death. This is what really drove the revolution.
As far as Abigail Adams went, a couple things that I didn't have time to mention were that she was a strong supporter of the Sedition Acts. And for those of you who don't know what they were, the Sedition Acts were passed during her husband's administration as an attempt to clamp a lid down on freedom of the press. And you could actually be thrown in jail for disagreeing with his administration for a short period of time. They were so unpopular that they were a major factor in his not getting reelected. But she strongly believed and strongly spoke out in favor of those. She thought that there should be, once the new country was set up, she thought it was perfect. There should be no dissent. Everyone should just work towards the new country. And then also in their later lives, she and John became Unitarians, which is kind of an interesting switch for someone born into kind of a Calvinistic Puritan family, especially the daughter of a pastor, because it's a much more kind of liberal religion. And she long believed that religion should be kind of non-dogmatic and inclusive. And so that was kind of an interesting transition for her religiously later.
The anti-sedition acts, by the way, they were more than freedom of press. It was freedom of speech. It would be like saying, because I don't agree with your political view, I'm going to put you in prison. I mean, it was that simple at some levels. And so it was a pretty rough time for us, trying to find our path.
And mostly used against Republican printers. So.
Let me just say one thing, too, about Dr. Johnson. They've been absolutely wonderful. Will you thank them? They've been great. So. I love the opportunity to honor our wonderful people, and Dr. Virginia Tinsley Johnson is really well known for doing Mary Wollstonecraft, and Mary Wollstonecraft had been almost forgotten in this country until actually Virginia brought her back here and then did her in other places like Colorado and Nevada. And Virginia then decided to do something that's one of the most remarkable things of the Popcorn Forum's years of history. She decided to go by herself and to go to Europe, and she took the route of everywhere Mary Wollstonecraft had gone, and kept a diary, and she came back, and we have television programs in the library about that. And so Virginia is one of our major performers, and I'll just say this as someone who coordinates this, and out of our 36 years, we've done it 8 times, 8 different years. They start working, most of them a year ahead of time, and they read, and then we have a wonderful costume designer, and Judith McGibbon, and she does all these costumes, and she just loves that process, and it's the most popular thing we do. And when I decided that after 7 years not to do it for a couple of years, some students said, well, I'm not coming again until you do the Chautauqua again. So it's very popular, and it's a very good way to learn. I'll turn it back over to Virginia.
I'll just say Chautauqua can change your life, and it really changed mine when I started that. And I really think for students, this is a remarkable way to learn. And I know that Charles lives this all the time, so I'm certain that he would concur that little learning is a dangerous thing. So when you drink deep, you really appreciate your history. And we really appreciate your coming here and supporting the college and its intellectual endeavors. So thank all of you, and hope to see you tomorrow.
And let me just add that 2 students will perform on the panel later, and they've worked at this a long time too, and they're both very excited about doing it. And other students have done it in the past. If you're interested in doing it and you want to go through the training and all, you see me. So we would invite you to do that. Welcome, Charles. And again, tomorrow morning we'll start over again in auditorium. Virginia, thank you so much for doing this.
Say we're gone out the country, baby, knock them miles down. Say we're gone out the country, baby, knock them miles down. Say we're going to a party with the best old fools around. This is a center with chicken, baby, eyes both nice and new. This is a center with chicken, baby, eyes both nice and new. Well, we gonna stop by Catfish Creek, sonny, unless you catch us a few.